Hello everyone and welcome back. Tonight we're going to be diving in to Starlight Tours Part 2, where we're going to be discussing the Saskatoon freezing deaths along with the survival story of Darrel Knight. If you haven't watched Part 1 where I discuss the death of Neil Stonechild, I definitely recommend you go watch that deep dive. It happens about a decade before the deaths we're going to be talking about today, so I definitely think it's worth watching first. And this deaths we're going to be talking about today that happened in the year 2000 that would eventually lead to the reinvestigation of Neil's death. As I said in Part 1, Starlight Tours are an act where a police officer will pick up a member of the Indigenous community, especially when they're drunk or intoxicated, and they will drive this individual outside of the city limits, and they will end up leaving that person there when it is freezing outside, usually temperatures as low as negative 28 degrees Celsius, and this results in many deaths that will later be ruled as hypothermia, because that's how the deaths present. And these individuals did die from hypothermia, and their cases are ruled as accidents, but it's how they got there that seems to be in question. Was there more to it? Is there foul play involved? And personally, I think so. And after watching this two-part series, I feel like you will definitely believe so as well. In an article from 2003, it reads, and I quote, "For years, Native men were turning up dead on the outskirts of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Many in the Native community suspected police involvement," end quote. So let's dive a little deeper into that theory. On January 29th of the year 2000, the body of 25-year-old Rodney Neistis would be found frozen in an industrial area just north of the Queen Elizabeth Power Station on the south side of Saskatoon, and his body was found by a politician who was out for their daily jog. Rodney was last seen alive around 1:30 a.m. leaving a bar on the south side of Saskatoon, and he was seen leaving carrying an open bottle of beer. His cousin was also expecting him home that night, but he never showed. After that, he just disappeared and then was found frozen in a field, much like Neil Stonechild. Days later, on February 3rd, the body of 30-year-old student Lawrence Kim Wagner was found in an isolated spot outside of Saskatoon, also by the Queen Elizabeth Power Station. He was found only wearing a t-shirt, socks, and jeans, and his shoes were missing along with his jacket. As far as I've seen, they were never found. However, unlike in Neil Stonechild's case, the socks that Lawrence was found wearing were actually clean, unlike Neil's, who were worn and dirty like he had been walking in them for a long time. 30-year-old Lawrence Wagner was also a student who attended Federated College and was last seen alive on the early mornings of January 31st, so days earlier before his body was found. A friend of Lawrence's named Kait would make claims that she last seen Lawrence being put into the back of a police cruiser the night of his disappearance. And as you can see, there seems to be a pattern with these cases. Lawrence's, Rodney's, Neil's. The last time these people are seen alive, they're usually drunk. They're usually seen in the back of a police cruiser, and then they're found dead in fields in clothing that isn't meant for the weather that they're in, and their cases are ruled hypothermia. There seems to be a pattern in every single one. But not long after the discovery of these two bodies, a man would speak out about surviving a Starlight tour. And this man was 33-year-old Darrel Knight, who was a member of the Cree Nations. And this was Darrel's story. On a cold night on January 28th, Darrel Knight was standing outside of his uncle's apartment where he had attended a party. Now, I've seen mixed stories. There had been a fight that night, and Darrel, who was drunk at the time, was said to have been shouting obscenities. That night, officers Dan Katchen and Ken Munson of the Saskatoon Police Services responded and picked Darrel up. Now, Darrel recalled thinking he was going to be taken to the drunk tank, but instead, the officers took him and drove straight out of town. The two officers and Darrel would end up about 5 kilometers outside of Saskatoon before the vehicle would roll to a stop. Darrel recalled the officers saying something along the lines of, "Get the fuck out of here, you fucking Indian." The officers then slammed his face on the hood of the trunk, took off his handcuffs, and let him stand there alone on a riverbank. He recalled saying, and I quote, "I'll freeze out here, what are you guys doing?" end quote. One of the officers would then end up responding to him saying, "That's your fucking problem." Darrel then watched as the police cruiser drove off, and he was left standing there alone in nothing but a t-shirt, jean jacket, running shoes, and it was negative 21 degrees Celsius. It would also turn out that Darrel had been left by these two officers not very far off from where the two bodies would later be discovered. Meaning, again, there seems to be a pattern. These officers in Saskatoon seem to have a spot where they like to drop people off, and it seems to be around this power station. Darrel was quoted saying, and I quote, "I thought I was dead, but something told me don't give up," end quote. And that's when Darrel began walking. He'd eventually end up walking several miles until he found the Queen Elizabeth's power station, and this is where a watchman would end up letting him in from the cold and saving Darrel from a fate many seem to face when they are left on Starlight tours. But Darrel thankfully survived. And if he hadn't have survived, I don't know if we would have any justice in any of these cases or if any of them would have been reinvestigated. But Darrel surviving that night set a ball rolling that no one was prepared for. Sometime after hearing about these two men being found dead, Darrel and his uncle would end up in another traffic stop with the Saskatoon police. But this time, something different would happen. They ended up being pulled over on a seatbelt violation, but thankfully, Darrel was pulled over by a good cop. And Darrel would end up getting into a conversation with this police officer about the two bodies that have been found. And I'm going to play with you a clip that contains Darrel and this police officer in a documentary. And I want you to hear the exact conversation that they had from their mouths. So I'm gonna play that for you now.
I asked them why they were interested in that particular event, and in talking with them, they relayed the information that they felt that it was related to the same type of incident that had happened to Darrel.
I told them, yeah, the cops dropped me off at the town by the power station there.
I sort of took up the conversation with them, asked them if they had reported that particular incident to the police service. And the comment was made was,
who's gonna believe me? I didn't think he'd believe me, you know that?
There's a number of things that went through my mind, and I guess one of the first ones was, this can't really be happening. And I just felt that the badge and the uniform that I represented to this community was damaged. But I did ask them for some time. And the reason I asked for that time was so that I could begin an investigation, relay the information to Chief Dave Scott, who was my chief at the time, and that way there was, it gave us time to find out exactly what was going on.
Next day, that cop that pulled us over, he pulls up. What does he want? I was thinking. And he goes, Darrel, come here. I was scared to go over there. And I go, what do you want, copper? He goes, remember you were telling me nobody will believe you? And I go, yeah, I believe you, he said.
So as I said, Darrel coming forward and speaking out about what happened to him is really what set the ball rolling and brought light to all of these cases and this whole concept of Starlight tours in general. And it also brought on a lot of outrage from citizens. And there were rallies, there were protests, a lot of stuff began happening when Darrel came out and spoke. It also led to an expose of one of the country's worst examples of racism. The Washington Post wrote, and I quote, "Over the years, at least 5 frozen bodies of Aboriginal men have been found in the same area. There were always rumors that the police had dropped them off, but there was nothing to prove it until the night Darrel made it back alive." End quote. And I seen it first that the Saskatoon Police Services wanted to take over this case and investigate, but then they eventually ended up handing it over to the RCMP, and the RCMP would eventually get involved and begin looking into the mysterious deaths around Saskatoon. And I am so thankful that they got involved because honestly, I don't know what would have happened if it was just the Saskatoon police looking into it, because I feel like there would be a conflict of interest there since they're the ones that are being investigated, you know? Now, regarding Darrel's case, this is going to make you big mad because it made me big mad. Darrel Knight's case would eventually go to trial, and constables Dan Hatchin and Ken Munson would eventually be convicted of unlawful confinement in September of 2001. And they were only sentenced to 8 months in prison. Keep in mind the maximum sentence for unlawful confinement is 10 years. But no, after nearly killing a man, and I say nearly because I think he would have died, but Darrel just ended up being very, very lucky that night. He ended up finding the power station. He walked the correct way. If that watchman hadn't been there and been able to let him in, I do think he would have died as well. So after nearly killing a man, they were only sentenced to 8 months in prison, which is insane, in my opinion. And just keep in mind that this case happened about 20 years ago. So these two officers are very much free right now. They barely got a slap on the wrist. On top of all of that, during the trial, they basically tried to blame Darrel for being dropped off there, saying that he was known to police and he had said to them, and I quote, "Look, boys, drop me off anywhere. Just don't take me in and charge me," end quote. So they just magically happened to be 5 kilometers outside of the city limits when they picked him up inside of the city and nowhere near the police station. And then he told them to drop him off anywhere. So they're like, Sure, we're not going to take you in and charge you. We'll just leave you here. Like, what kind of police conduct is that? They should have picked him up, taken him to the station. Either way, they're basically admitting that they did something wrong, because if they're admitting this, that they had just dropped him off in the middle of nowhere because he asked them to, what kind of police officer does that? You don't listen to the person in the back seat. You're supposed to follow the rules. And the rules are, you'd pick the person up and take them to the drunk tank or take them to the station, charge them with that whatever you're charging them for, because you pick them up to charge them. Like, you don't pick someone up for no reason and then just drive them 5 kilometers outside of the city and drop them off because they said they wanted out of the car. If any criminal in the back of the police car just said, oh, drop me off here, officers just don't drop people off. Do you get what I'm saying? It just makes literally no sense what these officers tried to argue. And what is their excuse for being 5 kilometers outside of the city? It makes no sense. The police station isn't 5 kilometers out of the city. Either way, they ended up getting a slap on the wrist. Both officers would also deny having any involvement in the deaths of Rodney and Lawrence, which honestly, I'm not surprised. They got off very light with Darrel's case, and putting their names on 2 cases where people ended up dying. I doubt they would ever admit to that, considering they didn't even want to admit to what they did to Darrel. But there does seem to be some sort of evidence that these 2 officers may have been involved in these other deaths as well, because it turns out that the night of Rodney's death, police records showed that the officers were on a break for roughly an hour just after 1 a.m. on January 29th of 2000. Keep in mind, the last time Rodney was seen alive was around 1:30 a.m., meaning there was definitely time for these 2 officers to just be driving around looking for trouble and picked him up because he was drunk, coming from a bar carrying a bottle of beer. So they could have got him on an open container charge and maybe public drunkenness, whatever. They had some kind of excuse to pick him up, and then they could have just drove him out to the power plant. In my opinion, they definitely had time to do that if they took their break from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. and they weren't accounted for. Yet according to these 2 officers, Munson would go on to say that he was at the gym during his break, and Hatchin would say that he had a general practice of staying at the station, which you think that could be corroborated. I feel like maybe there isn't evidence of that, or maybe there is, and I just don't know about it. But clearly, these officers say that they have alibis of some sort, but I don't know if there was evidence to prove their alibi. So there's that. I also see notes that both of these officers had around 18 years on the force. So just imagine what they had done in 2 decades if they did to Darrel what they did. I don't think it was a first-time thing, and it seems like there are a lot of other people that feel like this wasn't a first-time thing either. If they were capable of doing to Darrel what they did, I don't even want to know what else they could have done. And I say that because an article from the Globe and Mail read, and I quote, "Several police sources told the Globe and Mail yesterday that it was common knowledge among the force that some members would take unruly suspects out near the power plant and abandon them in the cold. The area is about a 10-minute walk from the outskirts of Saskatoon. One source said, they've been doing that for years. I've never done it, but I know people who have. If the guy pissed them off or they didn't have enough to lock them up, they just take them for a drive." In 2003, Saskatoon Police Chief Russell Sabo, which you would have seen him in the Neil Stonechild case, he admitted that there was a possibility that the force had driven other Indigenous people out of the city limits and left them in the cold, including a woman in 1976, according to reports by the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix. There was also a lot more drama and a lot more deaths brought into question as well. So let's start with the accusations by Darlene, which was the friend of Lawrence who witnessed him in the back of the police cruiser. Darlene says that she would go on to work with a sketch artist to draw the officer she claimed her friend was last witness with. Now, she said that she had printed her name on the top of the first sketch and signed the bottom. However, when the sketch was released to the media, it wasn't the same sketch she had signed off on. She claimed that there was supposed to be bags under the officer's eyes, and the face was not quite the right shape anymore either. She then spent hours drawing a sketch by herself that more resembled the officer she was remembered seeing. So basically, I feel like she's claiming that she did the sketch. They probably passed it around at the police station. They realized it was one of the officers there, changed the sketch a bit so it didn't actually resemble the officer that it was, so that he wouldn't get in trouble, and then, released that sketch instead. Allegedly, don't come for me. That is just what I feel like Darlene is getting at there. Maybe that's not what they did, but hey, that is what, in my opinion, it feels like Darlene is saying happened, because she does claim to sign off on the drawing, so it must have, been perfect, and then they released a different sketch. So that's a little sketchy in my opinion. But as I said, there were a couple more deaths that were brought into question, because on January 19th of 2000, 53-year-old Lloyd Dusty Horn was found frozen to death in Saskatoon, and he was found dead the day after he was taken into police custody for public intoxication. However, a jury in 2001 ruled his death a hypothermia, which technically is the ruling on every single one of these cases. So what does that even mean? It's, the reason why they ended up being out in the cold to get hypothermia that is being brought into question. Who put them out there? Who took them somewhere where they couldn't get into warmth, or they weren't dressed properly to be out in those conditions? Who dropped them off? So this whole like jury ruling it a hypothermia, honestly, I don't know what to believe with it. Then we have 33-year-old Darcy Dina Ironchild, who died on February 19th of 2000 after he was taken into custody for public intoxication on February 18th, so the night before. The Saskatchewan Justice Department said Darcy was released around midnight and then sent home in a taxi. Now, there was an inquest jury that said that the death of Darcy was an accidental one caused by an overdose of chloral hydrate, an old and rarely used sedative, most famously combined with alcohol surreptitiously to make what is called a Mickey Finn. So basically this cocktail of these two things together caused this person to die. In another case that was 25 years old in 2003, the RCMP looked into the death of a woman who allegedly was abandoned on the edge of town by the Saskatoon police. These are just a handful of cases where the Indigenous have been found dead in freezing temperatures and ruled hypothermia cases, or cases where the Saskatoon Police Department was involved right before these people died. It's strange and it's weird and it's crazy, and honestly, the overdose one, I don't know if they were involved with it, but it's just the fact that there is so many, way too many, one too many cases that all have the same storyline. Someone's picked up for public intoxication by the Saskatoon Police Services and they end up dead the next day. It's strange. It's really fucking strange. And it is so scary for the Indigenous people there that Darrel Knight ended up moving out of Saskatoon altogether, and he moved all the way to British Columbia. He moved provinces away. He was quoted saying, and I quote, "In Saskatoon, I found it very hard to recover from and move on from what they did to me that January night. I have never received an apology from the police for what they have done to me." End quote. And I want to take a moment to say rest in peace to Darrel Knight, because it turns out he actually died at the beginning of April. I think it was April 2nd, at the age of 56. But Darrel's memory will live on because of him coming out and exposing this very, very dark side of Canadian history. A very heinous and very twisted side of the Saskatoon Police Services, which honestly more people should know about. And honestly, I feel like it probably isn't just isolated to this one police department. I'm sure there are so many other departments around North America where shit like this happens, and it's just not talked about. In an article from 2004 on the Aboriginal Multimedia Society, it read, and I quote, "Relatives of several Native men who have also died in questionable circumstances in and around the Saskatchewan city are saying that they can't get anyone to listen to them," end quote. And that's why I want to talk about this. That was a quote from almost 20 years ago now. And this is still a topic that isn't well known. And I feel like it definitely needs to be more well known, because I'm sure it's still happening to this very day. 2004 is also when a documentary called Two Worlds Colliding was released. And this is a documentary where I used the clip earlier where Darrel and that police officer that believed him were speaking. The documentary really highlights Darrel's story as well as Starlight tours in general and what was happening during that time with people's outrage and the courts and the police department, just all of that stuff. So I definitely recommend watching that if you want to do more research on this topic and dive a little deeper. As we're nearing the end of this video, I want you to remember what I said in part 1, where the officers at the Saskatoon Police Services and the union were rallying in protest to the Neil Stonechild case. Let it sink in that everything I talked about today happened before the inquest on Neil's case happened. Multiple other men were found frozen to death in and around Saskatoon. Darrel Knight comes out and talks about his story. The two officers are convicted, literally convicted, of dropping him off in the middle of the night in the freezing cold to die. And then Neil's case gets brought back up again. The two officers in Neil's case get brought into the spotlight, and they don't spend any time in jail. Literally not 1 second of jail time for them. And this kid died. They are simply taken off the force, and then they get mad about it, and they try to protest it. That's 4 officers right there in the Saskatoon Police Services alone that are either put into jail or taken off the force because they are involved in dropping Indigenous men in the middle of nowhere to freeze to death. Yet, the union's rallying, there's people mad, and as I said in part 1, I completely support backing police officers. I think police officers are a very essential service. I think it's an incredibly hard job, but not when they're corrupt like this. And do I think that all the officers at the Saskatoon Police Services are bad? No. The officer in the documentary that believed Darrel, He seems like a great guy. He believed him. He's the one that helped bring all of this into fruition, and that would set the ball rolling into these other officers getting charged and convicted. I don't think all of the officers are bad, but I don't think that the union and the other officers should be rallying in support of these officers that are getting, kicked off the force or being sent to jail for this. I think that is pretty fucked up. I think it's sick, and I think it's a slap in the face to all of the victims and to all of the family members of the victims. And it's giving very much good old boys club when that started happening. But how do you all feel about this topic? I'm sure there are countless other names of victims out there that could be added to the list of Starlight Tour deaths that we may never even know because of these cover-ups, or simply because their deaths look like accidents. That's the whole thing. Like, it's so hard to prove that anyone did anything because their deaths look like accidents. But I am really glad that I got to dive into this topic and share it all with you all, because I definitely think this is a topic that needs to be more well known. I'm shocked that I never had heard about it until a couple weeks ago. This is the kind of shit that I think should be taught in schools that isn't. Like, there are so many little things that no one ever talks about, and this is definitely something that I think needs to be more well known, and I think more people need to be educated on, things that happen to our Indigenous people. The Highway of Tears is another thing that I would love to do videos on. There were so many cases that seem to be linked to the Highway of Tears. Let me know down below if you want me to eventually do some cases on that. But I definitely feel a lot more educated on the topic now, and I hope you all feel like you may be a little bit more educated on this topic. And now we all know a little bit more about a disturbing piece of Canadian history that, again, should be more well known. With that, I'm going to leave it all in the hands of you all. Let's chat about this down below. And if you'd like to share this video and spread the word on Starlight Tours, I would definitely appreciate it. With that, if you're not subscribed, I definitely recommend you hit that subscribe button. It allows me to create more videos like this, do more deep dives into topics like this, and it allows me to spend more time creating videos like this. With that, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.